Hello, this is Jim Phillips. What you're about to hear was recorded live on October 26, 2010. It is a radio interview that I conducted of two brand new first-time users of the PAL system. This delightful couple experienced the PAL system for the first time on February 5th and 6th, 2010. I think, in many ways, for people who are being introduced to these unique concepts for the first time, they are a better spokesman than I am. You see, people look at me as some kind of tough guy who's been doing these kinds of things for decades, that somehow I'm different than they are, and that these things just won't work for them. Well, let's see what you think after watching this program.
Good evening. This is Jim Phillips, your host of the Safe Harbor Alliance Self-Reliant Living Show. In this evening, I have a very special guest with me, as I always do, and I appreciate these people that take time out of their schedule to come in and just visit with us and share some of their experiences. Tonight, we're talking about a topic that's really kind of at hand right now since winter's on its way, and the concept is this, winter happens. In fact, it happened last year. It's happening this year. It's going to happen again next year. And sometimes emergencies happen, and sometimes these emergencies happen in winter. Are you prepared to survive a winter without heat or without any number of resources you might normally have? So tonight we're going to be talking about that with Jim and Connie Cheney, and I consider them to be very special spokesmen for what we're going to be talking about. You folks had some unusual experiences really this last year. And you spent some time up on a mountain ridge in the cold overlooking this beautiful valley that we were camped on. And as a matter of fact, I remember with some of the people when I was leading them up there, and we went right up on top of this ridge in an exposed area outside of the trees where the snowdrifts are piling up. And there were a few people when I stopped there, they were looking and they were like down at the trees and over the side in there, and they're going like, aren't we going down there? And the answer is, well, no, we're not. And that was unusual because usually you look for a more sheltered place. In our case, we chose a very unsheltered place because sometimes you may not be in the best of circumstances. This is up Logan Canyon in northern Utah, overlooking Middle Sinks on the west and to the east, overlooking Bear Lake Valley. And that's where we chose to spend some time up there. Let me ask you, Jim, a couple of questions. You had a little bit of, I'll say, some cold weather experience like most people do when you're growing up, and we all go outside and shovel some snow, and maybe we ski or do a few little things. And you grew up in southeastern Idaho where it's rather cold, and so you had some experiences early on with cold weather. Describe some of that, and because you know what cold weather is like and you know what it feels like to be cold.
Okay. A lot of people don't believe that southeastern Idaho could get that cold, but I saw temperatures that were between 55 and 60 below zero in January. And growing up in that, you obviously didn't spend tremendous amount of time outside without something over you to protect you. And growing up, I had a paper route, which I did summer and winter, and it was a several-mile paper route. And I had probably what was barely adequate clothing at the time even. And I know that often I'd come home and I'd get home about time to just head off to school, and I would then walk to school. And I was only a mile away from the school, so it wasn't that far. But I remember going into the restroom and putting my hands under water to get them functioning again so that I could go to class and actually use a pencil. That kind of environment was, I just kind of got used to that. It was just you outside, you hurt a lot, and then you come inside and hurt some more when you warm up.
And sometimes, we just come to expect in the winter, cold is the norm, and if you're going to be outside, you have to expect to, I'll say, suffer a little bit. It may be unpleasant, and you go inside to warm up. So you had experience growing up, and then later on, you've done a little bit out in the cold. I mean, besides just shoveling snow, you've been outside a little bit.
Sure.
You've had some experience with it, and you know what it feels like. Now, Connie, let me ask you, what was your cold weather experience prior to this ridge?
Well, actually, it was very little. A number of years ago, I did ski some, and even more years than that, I did some sledding. But I was a fair weather skier. The sun had to be shining, and as soon as I got cold or wet, it was time for me to head for the car and some hot chocolate. So I don't like to be cold.
So you wouldn't classify either one of you as a winter camping, freak, or you didn't look for winter to come around and decide we're going to go out there and spend a day or two or three or go someplace and build snow houses or igloos or anything like that. That wasn't your normal behavior, let's say, a couple of years ago. Would that be correct?
Oh, heavens, no.
Yeah, I would say that, while I've camped out in the winter, it was like, let's see how big we can make the fire, and so we can at least have one half of us warm.
Right. It's the old experience, playing the game of rotisserie. You stand around the fire and you just kind of slowly rotate around so that each side of you is eventually getting warm, but, of course, each side of you is also getting cold. And that was kind of the normal winter camping experience. Now, tell me what introduced you or how you became introduced to the concept of going outside in the winter, or certainly being ready to deal with cold and winter. What introduced you to that?
Well, Connie and I are very preparedness-minded, and for some time we had solved nearly everything, but the prospect of keeping the house warm in the wintertime and staying warm was a problem. And we didn't really have a really great solution. We had some solutions, but they didn't really go all the way. They weren't the most ideal solutions, and we weren't sure they would actually work in case it really was necessary. And so I heard about you, and I thought, this is intriguing. Let's see what he has to say.
So you came to some of these classes a little while back. When did you start coming to some of the classes I was doing?
We were thinking about that about 2006, and we started coming and thought it was an interesting concept and it's something we need to do something about. Unfortunately, due to some things beyond our control, we weren't really able to do something, get real into it, as you would, and get started on it. Well, when it finally came around the time where we could actually do something about it, then we moved ahead.
Yeah, you came to some of these classes for over 3 years and listened to some strange concepts, something that's different than what most people do. So you got concerned about or interested in cold weather and winter simply because things happen in winter. They could happen, and you were not 100% sure that you had a solution to staying warm, whether it's in a house or someplace else. And I think that's where a lot of people are. You hope you know what the answer is, but how do you find out? And, of course, one of the ways you find out is you go out and stay in the worst conditions you can find, and if you can handle the worst conditions, then if you're at home and don't have any heat, that's going to be easy, or other situations like that.
And storing up fuel didn't seem to be a realistic possibility.
For a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe even a month or so. Maybe even one season you could do that, but what if you get into something that extends, multi-year for whatever reason, and you just don't have the comforts that we normally have right now?
Yeah.
Now, you got serious about making, I'll just introduce something right here because we haven't talked about it, and this is what comes out of the classes. Winter Without Worries is the title of the class that I teach. And within it, we have this concept that we entitle PALS, P-A-L-S, which is an acronym for Phillips Arctic Living System. And within the PALS system is the PALS clothing, using a technology, using an approach that is different than just going down to the store and buying your typical layers and things like that. I'll talk about that at another time, so we won't go into that very deeply right here, other than what some of your experience has been and how it works. But it's not a layered system. It's a mono-layered system, and there's some things that are very unique about it and different that you just don't see anyplace else. Okay, so you came to classes, you listened to this, and then you got serious about making your own PALS clothing. Why did you do that? That's a lot of work, actually. So why did you do that? And I have an idea of some of the time that you put into it, and Connie put a lot of time into that. So both of you, why did you want to do that?
Well, the first thing I did is I bought a set of the thinner thermal johns, and I tried those out and was excited that they really actually worked for the kind of things that I was doing, going out in the yard and working in the yard, shoveling snow, stuff like that. And it worked much better than my other winter clothing, which I thought was pretty decent. And so then I said, well, that worked. Let's take the next step and let's see how much better that is.
Okay, now, Connie, at this time, you actually hadn't had any experience with inner thermal liners or the thermal johns at this point, had you? The thinner, the half-inch thick, is that correct?
That's right. I hadn't. I was basically just going on faith that what you were teaching was correct. However, I did think you were a little strange and probably had a higher tolerance to pain and cold than I did. That you could say, because you would always say, you can do this, you can go out. We'd see pictures, we'd hear stories about the places that you would go and test out the PALS system, and that you could stay warm and dry. And I think, well, I believe you, but I think that you just are less sensitive to the cold and pain than I would be.
I'm just a tough guy, right?
Yeah.
In spite of the fact that I point out I'm really a bigger wimp than probably anybody in the room.
Well, you say that, but, it's still hard to believe.
Okay, I understand. So you hadn't had any experience, but you did observe. I remember you telling me about what you observed when Jim was using some of this basic technology, this clothing, this thermal johns. It was different, using it as a insulated undergarment that went underneath regular clothing. And tell me about your observation there, what you started to see with him. And, Jim, if you comment a little bit more about when you say it was better, what do you mean it was better?
Well, it was very interesting because he put it on and he'd go out to shovel the snow, and I'd go out and check on him, and I'd say, how you doing? Are your toes cold yet? And he'd say, no, they're just warm. And I'd say, well, aren't you ready to come in yet? No, I'm not cold. And it was just quite amazing because he doesn't like cold weather either, and that had never happened before. He'd always get cold. So it was interesting to see that there was something different with what he was doing.
And not only that, usually when I came in after shoveling snow like that, all my clothes would be just soaked through. I came in, I was dry on the inside, and that's something we noticed immediately. That was like, wait a minute, this is really different.
Yeah, and one of the things that's very different about the way we do things is moisture management. Frankly, it's very easy to insulate. As far as insulating and trapping heat, that's easy to do. You can do it with all kinds of different materials, and you can even do it with, in survival situations with all kinds of simple things like wadded up newspaper. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. Everything has its, drawback in those cases. But the real magic, if you will, and the real performance comes from how you can manage moisture. It's about managing moisture. Moisture is a real problem, and it can build up in clothing, and it can be a very serious problem over an extended period of time. Anybody can go outside and play in the snow for an hour or two and come inside and you're okay. What if you have to stay out there all day? Or what if you're out there for 3 or 4 days? What if you're out there for weeks on end? So moisture management, that was something you were starting to observe. And what I appreciate about having you and others talk about this is, because I know for years people look at me and they'll say like, okay, tough guy, weird guy, or maybe he knows some tricks that none of us can learn, or he's just willing to put up with pain or whatever it is. And that's just not the way it is. Actually, there's a performance difference that is spectacular is what it comes down to. It lets you do some unusual things. Well, let's talk a little more about that. So you started to see some experience. You were hearing stories, and then you played with a little bit of one of I call it the downgraded system, you will. It's not an Arctic system, and it's not going to let you go outside and live for extended periods of time. So you were getting a little bit of experience with some things like that, and then that's when you really committed here a year ago to build the clothing. You were going to build it yourself, and that's one of the things I want people to understand. You can make these things if you wish to. There's a lot of work involved in it, but you can produce it, and that's what we've done throughout the years. Now, you went to Snow College. Let me explain that to people for just a moment. And I spell that Snocollegge, Snow College. You went to the basic training that we did a year ago in February. And not only did you go once, but you went 2 times. We'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, first off, you made the commitment that you wanted to go, and I think that's because you wanted to really find out if you could do this. Tell me a little bit more about why you decided to go I mean, making clothing is one thing, but going out and sitting on a mountain ridge in the dead of winter, that's just a little bit strange. And did people think you were strange, and why were you doing this?
Very much so. The thought finally hit me as we began to become invested in the time and expense of purchasing the foam and the materials. The idea finally hit me that even though here we think about, the possibility of an earthquake and being prepared for it, and I realized that I had, in all my scenarios that I had thought through and planned through, that I realized that it all had a summer background, that I would just go outside or, we'd be able to live outside and it would be nice and, and might be a little windier. But it never dawned on me that earthquake could happen in the middle of January, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a blizzard, until I started working on this. And that thought came to me so strong that what would I do if that were the case? I needed to know if this was going to work and how it works and if it was going to be something that I could survive. And so that was my main motivation for going to snow college. I didn't want to go. I still felt like I was going to be cold. I was going to be miserable. I had never gone camping without a tent. I didn't think I was going to like, just being out there in the middle of everything with nothing around me. I had always had a campfire, and this was in the summertime, and it just seemed like this was going to be a very miserable experience. But I wanted to find out if it would work because I would rather know now than if I'm in an emergency situation what I'm going to have to deal with. And I knew that this would be controlled, that we'd be with someone that had done it before, that would be there. So I just felt like it was more protected, more of a controlled situation. And also that, if I didn't like it, I could always go home because I wouldn't be very far from a car. And so that was, that was my motivation, is I really needed to see if this really worked.
And of course, you had friends and neighbors and everybody who was very supportive of this concept and encouraging you to go, right?
Oh, there wasn't anyone that supported me. They all thought that I had completely lost it. They just thought that this was the most ridiculous thing they had heard. Family, friends, neighbors, they thought we had, they just really thought we had gone off the edge by this point.
Okay. That you had completely lost it. All right. I understand. This is not normal behavior.
They don't believe us. They still don't believe us that we had a good time. They still think we're nuts.
Okay.
Another thing that I might mention is that I was the only one that had actually tried on my clothes before we got up on the mountain. And so Connie's first experience putting on the clothes was actually on the mountain. And because of that, we had a
blizzard.
And we had a technical difficulty with the boots because she'd never put them on before, and we had problems figuring out how to do it. Fortunately, we had somebody come to the rescue, and so she was able to complete it. But that's the kind of situation that she was. She was actually trying to back out the whole way.
Yeah, even while I was there, when my boots didn't work, I was ready to go home.
Looking for a reason to not do this. And now I want to clarify for people, the reason you hadn't tried it on, you had been working up to the very last minute. In fact, you were showing up kind of late up there because you were still making this stuff, and it wasn't even completed. That's another thing.
That's correct.
And the clothing wasn't all together yet, but yet it was together enough you could get it on. So it wasn't that you were let's say, weren't smart enough to say, let's try this on before we go. It's the fact that if you were going to come, you're just going to bring it as it was and take it on the fly. And you did that, and there were some difficulties, and they were significant. But as you said, it's controlled, and you can always leave. And that's the way we want to start people out, is with a safety net, so to speak. I mean, we're going to go on the high trapeze, but by golly, we got a net down there because if something doesn't work or you fall, you're not going to get hurt. You're going to gain experience from it. Part of what you said is very important. I want to characterize this as a formula in the way that I teach things. We have the law of provident living. The law of provident living has 4 parts to it, and it's spiritual attitude, knowledge, and stuff. It has to be in that order. And we're talking about knowledge because that's one of the key things that helps you change your attitude about things, which, by the way, we'll talk about because I want people to see what your attitude was before, what your attitude is after these things, because you gain knowledge. Knowledge is how you change your attitude and gain confidence. Knowledge is this. Knowledge, a very simple way of looking at it, is a little simple formula. K equals I times E. K, knowledge, equals information multiplied by experience. And you had been coming to classes, learning things, listening to the crazy man talk about these things and show pictures, but you said you wanted to know for yourself. That's where you gain the experience, because when you gain the experience and it's with correct information, now you have knowledge, and when you have knowledge, your attitude changes. So you came up there on this first trip. Now, the first trip, we landed up there. Basically, it snowed all the first day and through the night. And so you're up there in this weird clothing without any previous experience going out snow camping. I mean, you had not snow camped once in your life. Is that right, Connie?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, Jim had done a little bit before, but here you are on this ridge in this snowstorm, and you're sitting out there in this thing, and you've had some difficulties along the way, but you have the right attitude because you stuck with it. That was critical. Now, how did that first trip go? What were you starting to think as you're out there, and when did the realization come to you that maybe this was not like you thought it would be?
It was probably, I don't know, it was maybe 9:30 at night. The sun had been down for a while. It was still snowing. We were sitting there on snow blocks, sitting around just in the dark. There was a little bit, we had a Coleman lantern that was a little bit of light, but there was no fire. We had no fire. We were just sitting there in this snowstorm, and I just remember thinking, this is so amazing. I am sitting on top of this mountain in a snowstorm at night, and I am warm. I was not cold. I was just like I was sitting in my living room. My feet were warm. My hands were warm. My whole body was warm. I was not overly warm. I was just comfortable. I just felt like I was at home. And it was just amazing to me. I just kept saying, I know I must have said it. I must have just driven everybody crazy because I just kept saying, this is so amazing. I can't believe this. This is so amazing.
In fact, I remember one time you and Bonnie, we had a couple of ladies that were up there. There was, 8 of us, I think, in the snow college, 8, 9 of us. And I remember at one time you and Bonnie were talking about this. Bonnie was another one of our ladies up there who had not snow camped before. And some of the conversation, as I just listened into it, it's kind of like, if I'll paraphrase it, it's kind of like you're talking together and you're saying, like, I don't understand what's wrong. I should be miserable, but I'm not. Something's wrong because the mental image is, and everybody's image of being on a mountain ridge in a snowstorm outside of a tent, no campfire. You're just sitting out there in your clothing without any shelter. What's wrong with this picture? I should be wet, cold, miserable. I don't understand. That's kind of how the conversation went from my listening in. Is that correct? Would that be about the way you were thinking?
That is exactly correct, yes.
So after a few hours of being out there, you started to say, this is different than I thought, and as a matter of fact, I'm not miserable. Now, how about you, Jim? What was going on in your thinking as you're coming up there and you're starting to experience these kinds of things? What was dawning on you?
Well, I've had some experience with the other clothing, but that was the first time I'd actually worn the full PALS clothing, at least as much as it was. So I expected to be okay during the day. And I wasn't sure about night yet because I hadn't experienced that. And so I was not too concerned. In fact, I was motivating Connie to stick with it. She tried to bail, and I'd say, no, it's okay. We can work through this. Let's go. So, I was not too concerned. I'd been cold before. I've been in hypothermia before, and I thought, well, I'm not in hypothermia, so I'll probably be okay for a while.
So you were feeling like you're okay for a while and you'd be okay during the day, but when did it dawn on you that you might actually be okay all the way through?
Well, my body temperature stayed pretty much the same. In fact, we were getting ready to go to bed, and I was still saying, this is interesting. I wasn't getting colder. I thought, well, I may get a little bit colder. I'll still stay warm. And I also learned the value of water because I had not been drinking much water. And I actually did start to cool down. But once I drank about a pint of water all at once, and the coolness went away, and I was fine again and didn't have another problem the rest of the time.
And something I want to explain since you brought that up is that when we talk about the PALS system, Phillips Arctic Living System, it's not just clothing or equipment. It's actually the doctrine and understanding a lot of things, how the body works in the cold, the physiological response to the cold. It's about nutrition, hydration, working with the snow structures. It's a whole bunch of things. It's the doctrine that goes along with some of the key components like the PALS clothing, because you could have all the other doctrine and not have the PALS clothing, and it certainly helps to have the doctrine and understanding, but the clothing gives you a tremendous advantage in performance. So it is a system, and that's what I want to emphasize. It's not just clothing. It isn't just a sleeping bag. It isn't just nutrition. It isn't just how to build a snow house or cut snow blocks. It's actually everything together as a system that we're talking about. Connie, you were going to say something, I think?
Yes. I wanted to mention that Jim was talking about how and I even said how I wanted to bail. My head wanted to do this, but, I still was concerned about my past experience being cold. And also, I am a grandma, but I'm not one of these athletic backpacking kind of grandmas. I'm an overweight couch potato type grandma. So it was pretty easy for me to find, a reason to leave. If something's not working, it was easy for me to think I can't do this. But Jim was very good at, he kept saying, no, you can do this. We want to check this out. And he was so good at helping me through the challenges, because there were some challenges that I had to overcome. I had foot surgery, so I don't walk real well. I have problem knees and was quite overweight and not used to doing a lot of exercise. And, of course, and just any time you're up in the mountains, there's, exercise just moving around. And so there were some challenges I had to learn to deal with, but the cold was not one of them. I was not cold. I never did get cold. Even though Jim did get cold because he wasn't drinking, I didn't experience that. And that was just a wonderful motivating factor for me to realize that I didn't have to have a tent, I didn't have to have a fire, and I wasn't cold.
In other words, if you had been in, let's say, a tough situation, let's say that it's a real emergency or a disaster, and if you had been, prepared in all other ways, and let's say physically your health and all these things are right, and you had a lot of good equipment, you had food, you had all those things, but if you had been cold, being cold is really hard on your attitude, is it not?
Yes.
And the fact that you were not cold, even though you had all these other problems going on, and you had a number of them that were happening there. I mean, your clothing was not finished, and things weren't together quite right. But yet you weren't cold, as basic as things were, and we'll say just kind of as primitive as they are. Now, I point this out to people because I want you to understand it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to look like it just came off of the rack at the designer outdoor store. It can be rather crude. It can be, well, you've seen some of the things I make. In fact, it's ugly. But it's not how it looks that matters. It's how it performs. And so the fact that you were having all these other troubles, but you had, number one, both of you had, I think, an amazing attitude about wanting to do this. And then the fact that you were not cold allowed you to do something that should have been impossible.
Correct.
Is that characterizing it correctly?
That's correct. It was pretty borderline impossible for me to do what I did. Just walking around in the snow, because I'd sink down quite a bit when you have a lot of weight. I would sink down into the snow. It was quite an effort for me to move around, to get up and down. So physically, it was very challenging. It's not close to impossible, but the fact that I wasn't cold made all the difference in the world. It made it so that I was willing to try.
And that's one of the things I want to, emphasize to people is that if you can eliminate some of some of these issues, some of the challenges that you have, if you have something you can hang to, if you can anchor on, if you have experience and knowledge and you have some things that are working right, and then you can control your attitude and your feelings about things. When everything is wrong and when you're miserable, and the winter is one of those times when a lot of things can go wrong, and it's very easy to get miserable out there. It's very difficult to keep your attitude up, and if you lose your attitude, we're talking in a survival situation, in an emergency situation, if you lose your attitude, you can very easily lose your life because you just quit. You just get to the exasperated physically, mentally, and emotionally exhausted to the point where you simply say, I can't keep doing this, and so you just literally stop. And if somebody isn't there to rescue your hiney, you just curl up in a ball and it's all over. And that happens a lot to a lot of people where they quit. So it is critical to find ways to keep yourself going. Attitude is extremely important, but if you're suffering in all areas of your physical life, it's difficult to keep your attitude up. So one of the reasons we look at being comfortable, it's not because we're wimpy, it's not because we're just a bunch of softies, but quite frankly, pain and misery, and cold in particular, cold is unusual in its ability to drain your emotions, drain yourself physically, physiologically, mentally, and emotionally. Being cold is very, very tough on you. And as you go into hypothermia, you have literally things in your body that starts to shut down and close down, and you just don't have the capacity to keep going. And that's why I do so much of my work in this area of cold weather and winter and helping people to be prepared for it, because you can have everything else working perfectly, and if you're cold and suffering in the cold and going into hypothermia, your food and your water and all your other things will not be enough to get you through. You've got to maintain core temperature. It's all about maintaining your internal temperature. I really appreciate your experience and what you went through and some of the learning that you're exemplifying, because there was a lot of things that were not right, but the fact that you weren't cold allowed you to be okay through this whole first experience. And the first one was a little rougher because, again, some of the things were not quite completed, and this is your first time. I mean, you're doing something that's just like, how about wacko? People don't do what you were doing out there.
Yeah, it was amazing that and there were some of the challenges were really extreme, which the next time we went up, we did things to solve those, and our clothes were a little bit more complete at that point, and so there was a lot of things, and we'd solved the technical problem with Connie's boots, and so the second time we went up there thinking, okay, we're great, and then we had another challenge, and so each time there was a different challenge that we had to overcome.
That's really what the experience is all about, and that's the reason we go in very controlled situations, because if a challenge becomes too much, you bail out. There are periodically, I've seen this happen with people, that they get a little information, they watch a movie, they read a book or something like that, somebody that's been doing something, and then they want to go out there and do what he did, but they just go all the way. You know, you have somebody that's been working up to these things for years and trying a little bit and getting it all down pat, and so they spent, several years building up to the point to do something. Somebody watches that in a television program or in a movie or reads a book and says, by golly, I can do that, and so they go sit on top of this mountain peak, and something wasn't right, they get themselves in trouble, and sometimes they die when they do that. So what you're illustrating also is the fact that you came, you put up with difficulties, you got through it, yet you had a good experience, at least it was interesting enough you could call it good, so that you could come back having solved those problems. And what it is, it's like climbing stairs. You're taking it one step at a time, moving up to a higher level. Let's talk about that second time. I mean, now some people would look at you and say, well, you didn't learn your lesson the first time, did you? You came back again about 3 weeks later. You came back and we did it again. Why did you do that?
Well, because we had made some changes and we wanted to check those out. And then we ran into another challenge, and we've since done some things to solve that challenge. And so there may be other challenges ahead, but I think we've got the basic things taken care of. And we know what we need to do. And, if it was just a matter of being out in the cold and surviving, I think we're going to be able to do that just fine.
I'd like to add something to that. My reason for going the second time was not we did want to check things out, improvements that we had made, but it was also that in spite of the challenges, I really enjoyed the first time. I couldn't believe how beautiful it was in the morning, watching the sun come up through the trees that looked like a fairyland. There was a glittery kind of look to the trees, and it was the most magnificent, beautiful scene I have ever seen. It was gorgeous. Watching the fog as it lifted off of the valley below us as the sun came up, and just the beauty of it, the quiet and stillness. It was just beautiful, and I wanted to experience that again. I wanted to be able to do that, to see those things, that the nature, that I had never experienced that part of nature before, and it was just, there's just not words to describe it. It was just fabulous.
And that is one of the reasons that I have always gone. It's not a macho thing. It's not to prove how tough I am or anything like that. I go because it's extraordinary. I go because it's beautiful. I go, as you say, like when the sun was coming up, it was breathtakingly still. And it had snowed, on the first trip it had snowed, so everything was covered up and everything was just beautifully fresh and clean. And you just don't get to see that very often. So, yeah, that's the reason I've gone for decades, to see things and smell and taste and feel and watch things you cannot see any other way. So there's a real bonus in going. This is not just about, emergency preparedness training and we're going to get a bunch of skills. Frankly, it's breathtaking. It's a wonderful thing to do. So that's a good reason to go, and thank you for sharing those thoughts there. Now, back to this second trip. Okay, you wanted to come because you saw beauty that you hadn't seen before, and that's kind of a draw. You did want to check out and change some things. But now what was your attitude about going out this second time in terms of what you were feeling, the anxiousness or the fear or those kinds of things? What were you feeling, Connie?
I was excited about going. I just felt like that it was going to be a piece of cake. I knew I would be warm. I was looking forward to it. I had no intention of not completing the trip until I got there and then found out I had to hike up to the top of the mountain because the snow was too soft for the snowmobile to take me up. And that became quite a challenge for me to figure out how I was going to hike up there. But I worked through it. My angels came to my rescue and brought me some snowshoes and taught me how to use them to help me get up the hill. And I made it and had another wonderful experience. But just knowing that I did it the first time and knowing that I was able to stay warm, I slept through the night, I slept well, I wasn't wet and cold, I knew that I could do it again.
Yeah, when you slept through it, both these times we were not in tents, you were not in a tent, you were not in a snow cave, you weren't in an igloo, you weren't in a snow house, you were right out there in the open, in your sleeping system with the sleeping bag and some other components, and in this case, wrapped up in a plastic sheet.
A plastic sheet right on the ground, right on the snow, right on the mountainside, just under the stars. In fact, when it quit snowing, I woke up, and after I got the snow off the top of me, the sky was beautiful. It was just clear. It looked like I could touch the stars. They were so bright and clear and beautiful. It was just magnificent not having a tent to keep me from seeing the beauty there.
It's one of the problems with a tent. You can't see anything. You look at the inside of a tent, and it's pretty boring. That's why I like sleeping out where I can see when conditions allow. It's a marvelous thing to do. So your attitude had changed, and the thing that caused your attitude to change was the experience that you had that gave you knowledge, and that's the point. When we talk about the law of provident living, which is, again, the order of spiritual, attitude, knowledge, and stuff. The spiritual is the foundation for everything, but it's our attitude that's going to let us get through. And if you lose your attitude, it's really hard on you in many areas. But you change your attitude about things by getting knowledge. Knowledge is information multiplied by experience. You have to get true, correct, credible information, multiply it by the right experience. All of a sudden you have knowledge that says, I can do this. This is not a big deal. It changes your whole outlook on things. Okay. Now, the second trip, by the way, it was colder. The first one, we were in a snowstorm all the time, and when it's snowing, it's generally warmer. If I remember right, it was 15 degrees after it stopped snowing on the first one. We were sitting out there in this snowstorm. Now, here's another thing. No shelter, no poncho, no raincoat, no nothing. You're just in this clothing. And, by the way, it's one-layer clothing. You're sitting out there, and you got this snow hanging all over you in this first trip. And so, were you soaking wet or what?
There was snow all over me, but I was not wet on the inside. And I went to bed with, like you tell us, I went in and got in my sleeping system. I left all my outside clothes on except for my boots. I took my shells off that were my boots. They're kind of bulky. I took those off, but I left everything else on as I crawled in with the snow. I took the snow into bed with me. and I was not wet. When I woke up, I was dry.
Now, what you just described is breaking what we would call the traditional rules of snow camping. And I do make that point. We do break some traditional rules. Now, we don't break the laws of physics. We don't break the laws of nature, but we do break some of the traditions that we have been taught about how we live out there. Of course, you have to do it the right way, because if you don't have the skills and or the knowledge and or the materials, if you will, in this case the clothing, that's going to allow you to do that, you can get yourself in trouble. So you went to bed with this snowed-on clothing and left it all on, which is breaking a rule, went to bed. You didn't get wet during the night. You stayed dry, and you got up in the morning and you're warm and dry. Now, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty weird, but it really happened.
In other winter camps I've gone on, you don't take anything but basically your body and underwear into the sleeping bag, which was real fun in the morning, putting it all back on.
Yeah, you don't take those things to bed with you because they usually have a lot of moisture in them. Yeah. And then that's going to build up inside of your sleeping bag, and then you're going to have a wet sleeping bag, which is really awful. I've been there, done that, and in the old days when we're doing it the old way.
Well, then you've got to do it in reverse, and at that point, everything is frozen. So you're putting on frozen clothing, and for some reason that's supposed to be the right thing to do. It's probably about as painful as having somebody hit you with a leather strap while you're getting dressed.
Yeah, it's pretty much abuse. And, again, that's the way we used to do it back in the late 50s and early 60s when we were camping, snow camping the traditional way. It was like, take your wet clothing off, don't take it to bed with you, and then in the morning you have to put the wet clothing on. Of course, then the wet clothing is now frozen into this lump, and so you're putting on this icy clothing. And that's really a dumb thing to do, quite frankly, was my conclusion. So we break some rules, traditional rules. But we don't break the laws of nature. We don't break the laws of physics. So now your attitude is allowing you to look at this winter a little bit differently than the way you might have looked at winters before. Tell us a little bit about what you're looking forward to.
How many times have I already asked you this fall, Jim, when we get to go snow camping? I think it's been at least 5 times. When are we going to have our next snow camp?
I'm going to have to apologize for having just totally corrupted you, just messing you up. Is that what I've done? I've just kind of messed you up.
Yeah, I believe so, because I am actually looking forward to having enough snow in the mountains that we can go snow camping again, to be able to go out. And we actually got some snowshoes so that I won't sink in the snow as much. We want to prepare ourselves with the next couple of snow colleges series, because we really want to go on this trip above the Arctic Circle and be able to do this for an extended period of time. And so we're looking forward to the training that's involved to be able to do that. And it's been such a motivating factor for me that I've actually lost 75 pounds since we went to our last snow camp, which I think will help me tremendously in being able to move around a little bit better this time. So I'm really looking forward to it.
You're going to have to make some adjustments to your clothing, huh?
I have to remake my clothing, yes. That's my project right now, is I'm actually starting to make me some new clothing because my clothing doesn't fit me now.
Well, this is a lot of fun. First off, I'll describe to people a little bit about Snow College. We do this in stages. What I call Snow College 101 is where we go out. It's like a afternoon, a night, and by noon the next day we're gone. It's kind of a 24-hour experience, and it's to let you get a feeling, have I made a big mistake in this? Is something just totally wrong? It's not working, it's falling apart, it doesn't fit, or whatever it is. That's what Snow College 101 is about, is to give you the basic experience of working in the snow, staying out there, getting a feel for things, and it's a confidence builder, but it's also done in a very controlled environment. We're not very far from a car, and if you need to leave, you can leave. So that's Snow College 101. Snow College 201, when we go into the 200 series, we're now going to go for an extended period of time. You know, anybody can just kind of fake it through one night. You could go out there in blue jeans and long johns and traditional layers or whatever it is, and you could suffer through 24 hours and go back home and never want to go again, of course. But you can't fake your way through 3 or 4 days and 2 or 3 nights, because that's when you find out, when you're out there continuously, night after night after night, day after day, because now things start to break down. And the biggest thing that becomes problematic is moisture buildup in the clothing. So that's why we go for a 3 to 4 day experience. Again, it's drive up. And it's also in a situation where you can bail out, you can leave if you needed to, if something, again, is wrong. And we don't want people, if they have trouble, to go like, oh, this was terrible, I'm going home and I'm never coming back. It's like, okay, I learned what's wrong, I'll go home and I'll come back. We haul up big 2-burner Coleman stoves, we take Coleman lanterns, and we have a snowmobile and a sled. You can take the kitchen with you if you want, it's fine.
Well, we even had people bring popcorn poppers.
Yeah, we had it was fun. We had popcorn up there. We had things like that. I mean, it's a lot of fun. Then we go to the 300 series. But now when you get a little more serious, a little more advanced, you have to be able to get it in a backpack in a size, a volume, a weight that you could carry if you had to. The 302 and the College 302 we'll actually take a snowshoe trip for 3, 4 days, 5 days on snowshoes where now you're living from the volume of backpack. Now, you don't have to do that one if you're not physically able to, but it's available to people if they want to. Then the 400 series that you were talking about we will then take people that now they're prepared. They've gone through the steps, the stages. They've been solving their equipment. We've been checking them out. They're checking themselves out. And then what we're going to do this next late winter, early spring, is travel above the Arctic Circle and to a cold soak. Cold soak meaning this. We're going to live where the temperatures are below zero 24 hours a day. A marvelous experience, but you have to work up to that. We're not going to take people the first time out. You're going to have to go through these stages, prove to yourself that you can do that. Now, that's what you were talking about. You said you're actually looking forward to taking a vacation up north outside. Is that a change of attitude or what?
It's definitely a change of attitude.
Now, the point in all of this is, and it is about the attitude, but your confidence level, and this is what I want people to understand, is your confidence level in the ability to deal with an issue. And let's talk about winter, cold weather. Let's talk about disasters, catastrophes in the winter. Your confidence level is built because you know that you can do that because you've already been playing with it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. It's the experience, having experienced it, to see for myself that it actually works and I can do it.
And it's not something that's artificial, that you just kind of, somebody gives you a badge and says, aren't you really cool? This is something that's coming out from inside of you.
Yes, yeah. It still is amazing to me. I still have a hard time believing that I feel this way about it because it just doesn't seem like a natural thing. It seems kind of odd.
Well, I would say in our society and the way most of us live, this is pretty strange. Like, this is not what people typically do. In fact, most people up north, they're thinking about, I hope I can go to Florida or, Phoenix or Southern California, in January. We're going to head up above the Arctic Circle and spend some time out there. And I hope we have a nice little crew of people that are fully trained, have the experience, have been working up to it. And that's one of the things I want to emphasize to people. We're talking about cold weather and winter here. But in your personal preparedness, it's vitally important that you not do it from a position of theory. In other words, I read the book, I watched the DVD, I listened to the weird guy on the radio, whatever it is, where we're talking about water or sanitation or food or clothing or winter first aid or any of those things. It's not because you listen to somebody talk about it. That's a place to start. And you read the books and you watch the DVDs and those things, but you need to play with it. You need to get that, if you will, that mental memory and also the muscle memory and the attitude memory of having done these things so that when you find yourself in an emergency situation, you don't freeze, you don't panic, you don't break down, you don't give up, you don't emotionally collapse. And that's one of the things that will be a serious problem for many people when you hit these emergencies is they may emotionally collapse. So it is doing that. And so once again, as we're kind of coming up to the end of our programming here, and I appreciate your time so much and your enthusiasm and your support for these things and your willingness to share with other people who may not have a lot of winter experience, or their winter experience may have been when they were a Boy Scout or when they were a scout leader and they did the Klondike Derby or they went out on the elk hunt or something like that. It's like, well, I'm glad this didn't last very long because it's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of people that have that kind of an attitude. So just tell us a little more about what your feelings, your thoughts, and again, I appreciate the time that you would share with us these last few minutes we have. What would you encourage people to do?
Well, one thing I'm finding out is that it becomes things you can use for other things, for recreation. It's nothing finer than to get up early in the morning when it's in the 30-degree level at 9,000 feet, on a mountain lake and go fishing and feel comfortable. And you can do that with this kind of clothing. And so that becomes an added benefit. You can do other things that you wouldn't have normally done because it was just uncomfortable.
And you've had a little experience this summer with that when you talk about it using the lighter weight clothing, the thermal johns, in above freezing or near freezing conditions and being comfortable in a way that you've never been comfortable before.
Right, and you enjoy doing those things because you don't do it just to say, well, I went up there and I fished because I was freezing to death, but you're actually comfortable doing it. And so it becomes part of your lifestyle.
Yeah, and it does. In fact, preparedness and all these things become part of your lifestyle. We want to encourage people to play with this stuff, all the different things that you're doing to be prepared. You play with it. Make it a part of your lifestyle and enjoy it now so that it's not something you have to try and read the instruction manual on and hope you can figure out when you're in the middle of the mess that you may find yourself in. Connie, what's your feelings now still? Again, what can you encourage people to do?
I would really encourage people to be really involved enough to come to the online classes that you're going to have from November through December. I mean, they're easy to do them online. We traveled and, we actually spent like 2 days for like the whole day learning how to do some of these things. And I just would really encourage people to do the online class. Listen to the stories that you have. Listen to the principles behind this clothing and the system to really learn about it and then do it. It's not that hard to build some clothing yourself. And it takes some time, it takes some effort, but I would just really encourage people to do it. It is unbelievable how it works, and you just have to learn it for yourself.
I guess you now understand why I say anyone who wants to can learn to break the cold barrier. It's not because I'm tough. In fact, because of age and some significant injuries, I'm now much more susceptible to the cold than I used to be just 15 years ago. Jim and Connie didn't do this because they're tough and have been doing these things for years. They can do this because they took the time to learn the principles and obey the laws of nature, the laws of physics. I'll teach you the principles, and then you can break the cold barrier. Learn about Winter Without Worries at safeharboralliance.com, where you can also see the video on the history of PALS. This is Jim Phillips, hoping you'll have a terrific day.